difficult time to try and buy a house. Costs are up, interest rates are up, inventory is way, way down, and competition is stiff. I'm a millennial, and all my peers want to buy houses, corporate investors want to buy houses, and Airbnb investors want to buy houses. In fact, Airbnbs seem to be everywhere. New York City now has more Airbnb listings available than apartments for full-time rent. I mean, I'm not in my home studio. Am I in an Airbnb right now? No. I'm actually at a friend's place right now because T-Bone, my partner, and I are technically homeless. John Ralphio, we miss you every day. You can't go on TikTok without getting roughly a gazillion videos about how buying an Airbnb is your path to wealth, or seeing some like 22-year-old buy their first place, renovate it, and turn it into an Airbnb. Why are Airbnbs so all-encompassing in our housing market? Are they ruining the market for would-be first-time homebuyers? Are they a new form of gentrification, or do they represent a way for your average Joe to get into the housing market and actually turn their house into a cash-flowing investment? We're going to answer these questions, but before we do, go ahead and give me a like on this video. Now, before the real estate investors come for me, I want to say at the top that there is a certain percentage of Airbnb owners who are using the platform to stay housed themselves. Because let's not kid ourselves, the United States is not an affordable country. Even if you live in the middle of nowhere, Idaho, which, no offense to Idaho, you're a beautiful state, cost of living and housing prices are expensive in the United States. Healthcare, housing, food, transportation, these are all things that have gotten way more expensive in the US over the last 10 years, but most especially in the last 2 years. So renting out your basement or even building a tiny house in your backyard is a way that a lot of very normal people are using Airbnb to do things like manage to meet their mortgage payments or pay their property taxes. But it's not just the cost of buying and maintaining a house that's been going up. Rent prices have been going up as well. Where I live in Austin, Texas, rent has risen 48% from May 2021 to May 2022. Median asking rent is now $2,707. Yet minimum wage remains at $7.25 here in Texas and also federally. But that's a different video. Housing in the United States and in many other parts of the world is, for lack of a better word, a total disaster. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, we're underbuilt as a nation with about 4 million more housing units needed. Huge parts of the largest generation in American history, millennials, are finally ready to buy a home. For the last 2 years, interest rates were at historic lows, increasing the desire for people to buy a house and lock in a low interest rate. COVID made people stay home, thus skyrocketing the value of homes. And we have truly terrible zoning laws across the country that limits the type and amount of development available. But also, we've got Airbnb investors, aka people who are buying primary residences and turning them into short-term rentals. And this is really an issue across the whole country. It's not isolated to certain markets, though it can be seen most dramatically in vacation destinations such as Kissimmee, Florida, or the entire state of Vermont. Now, while the rise of Airbnb can be partially contributed to the increased cost of housing, that's not the entire reason. Airbnbs represent a way for normal people to become what is essentially a hotelier and to amass a short-term rental empire where they are able to cash flow out of these houses and live, frankly, very wealthy lives. I know multiple people who, here in Austin, which is consistently ranked one of the best cities in the United States and has an average of about, I think, 115 people moving here per day, who have bought houses in gentrifying neighborhoods and taken them off of the long-term rental market by turning them into Airbnbs. And these people absolutely do not see themselves as displacing their fellow city residents or as part of the housing crisis that Austin finds itself in. The housing crisis, they say, is the fault of institutional investors, such as BlackRock or Zillow. And we hear a lot about institutional investors in the news. And let me be clear, when we say institutional investors, what I'm referring to are private companies, usually hedge funds or private equity firms, who are coming in with lots of cash and buying up regular homes to then rent out to regular folks like you and me. Traditionally, institutional investors have been interested in buying multi-family housing, such as apartment buildings. And that makes sense from a business perspective. If you have more units to rent out, you have a better chance at making a higher profit. Single-family homes have traditionally been less attractive to institutional buyers, but since COVID, they have moved into this market. But how much of the housing market do institutional investors really make up? Studies show that institutional investors make up less than 3% of the total US housing market. iBuyers, aka companies like Zillow, actually purchased a total of 70,402 homes in 2021. And I mean, far be it from me to defend our corporate overlords. That's not what this portion of the video is. I'm not out here saying, but who will think of the corporations? But the truth is, a much bigger portion of the market is made up by smaller investors, normal people who are buying homes to rent them out as short-term rentals. And this brings us back to the question, is Airbnb ruining the housing market? When it was first founded in 2008, Airbnb was a way for homeowners, or renters even, to make a little bit of extra cash by renting out a space in their apartment to people who needed a quick place to stay. The name comes from the fact that co-founders and former housemates, Brian Chesky and Joe Geba, were struggling to pay their rent in San Francisco. The two designers noticed that there was a conference going on in San Francisco and all of the hotels were booked up. They literally put down 3 air mattresses and offered them along with a breakfast to anyone who was attending the conference on a homemade website called airbedandbreakfast.com. They hosted 3 designers for $80 each, and Airbnb was born. And it is from those humble beginnings that we now have this giant billion-dollar company and some fuel for the housing crisis that we're experiencing here in the United States. For the last 8 years in particular, Airbnb has basically turned regular people into mini hotel owners. There's no limit from the platform itself on how many houses an individual can buy. There's also just no limit in the United States, like by law, for how many houses an individual can buy. And there's no limit on how many houses you can list on a short-term rental site, such as Airbnb or Vrbo. And listing a house or an apartment as a short-term rental almost always guarantees more income than a long-term rental. You can rent out a 3-bed, 2-bath home in certain markets for $250 a night, and if it's booked out for a full 30 days, that's going to be $7,500 a month. For long-term renters, that same house would probably get you between like $2,300 or $2,500 a month. So we're talking about a difference of $5,000 a month in income. The stats on how many short-term rentals there are truly mind-blowing. There are over 6 million listings around the world, over 4 million hosts, and over 100,000 cities and towns have listings. Airbnb did $5.9 billion in revenue in 2021. In the US alone, there are over 660,000 Airbnb listings. And these range from a room to rent to entire houses and apartments. And these listings have hit certain cities really hard. Galveston, Texas is a beach town about an hour outside of Houston, and it's very popular. Over the last 3 years, Galveston has really begun to wrestle with a housing problem, due in large part to short-term rentals taking over their market. Galveston has added 1,000 new Airbnb listings per year in the last 3 years, and is on track to have fully 1/3 of its housing stock be full-time short-term rentals within 5 years. Joshua Tree, California actually has a very similar story, and it's the perfect case study for understanding how a town thrives and how a town dies. I didn't really mean for that to rhyme, but it did. With Airbnb comes jobs. This is one of the main arguments of Airbnb owners, and it makes sense. One of the main arguments in favor of Airbnbs is that with Airbnbs comes jobs. Airbnbs are often renovated, especially to be cute and Instagrammable, and so that means hiring local contractors, electricians, plumbers, as well as doing things like buying furniture or perhaps hiring local artists to make murals to make that perfect Instagram moment at your Airbnb. And ongoing costs are things like paying property managers who are managing the Airbnb bookings and a house cleaner who have to clean between each guest. That's money that the Airbnb economy does put back into its local economy. But is it enough to offset what they take from a local economy? A New York Times article highlighted just how severely Joshua Tree has been impacted by the rise of short-term rentals. It's transformed from a small, quiet desert town to a must-visit destination, especially by a wealthier class of people. Demand for short-term rentals surged by 54% in Joshua Tree between 2019 and 2021, making Joshua Tree one of the top 2 fastest-growing markets in California and one of the top 25 fastest-growing markets in the United States, according to data from AirDNA, a company that collects and analyzes data from Airbnb and Vrbo. Over the past 2 years, the price of the average home rose more in Joshua Tree and nearby Landers and 29 Palms than in any other part of California, according to an analysis by the San Francisco Chronicle. One realtor who worked in Joshua Tree said plots are now selling for quadruple 2019 prices. Short-term rentals are increasing the overall cost of housing in Joshua Tree as well as displacing year-round residents. One person interviewed for the New York Times article was Tonya Hansel, who works 7 days a week as a short-term rental house cleaner, and she earns between $60 and $150 per cleaning. Tonya lived in Joshua Tree up until very recently, since the age of 4. She's now 36. She paid a monthly rent of $575 up until recently when her landlord told her that she had to move out. And she couldn't find a place to live within Joshua Tree because, in her words, all the housing is either an Airbnb or 3 times what I can afford. Here's the thing about towns and cities. You need people to live in them year-round. Towns cannot survive if they are only inhabited by people who are there for a long weekend vacation. That cute cafe you want to go to get your morning coffee when you're on vacation, or that treetop zip line you want to take so you can get that perfect GoPro video to put on TikTok. Those are businesses that need people to work there and thus need people to live in that town so they can operate the business. You see the circle that we are making here? If the only businesses in town are related to short-term rentals, that town can't survive. And if everything in a town, from housing to food to experiences, is going to be priced at a luxury rate, then wages need to keep pace with that so that people can afford to live there. That means your coffee shop barista needs to be paid enough to afford to live in an expensive vacation town year-round. You see this a lot in towns like Stowe, Vermont, or Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They become the playgrounds for wealthy people who can afford to stay in the Airbnbs and can afford the ski day passes. But those ski lifts are operated by people who are often earning $10 an hour and have to live outside of the places they work. Now, these workers who, like I said, are often not getting paid a lot, have an additional burden of having to transport themselves 30, 40 minutes away each night when they want to go home and then get back into Jackson Hole the next day to operate that ski lift. While the cost of living or playing in these areas rises, wages often don't. When it comes to places like Joshua Tree or any other kind of vacation destination, it's also really important to think about where the money from these Airbnb rentals is flowing. Is it staying in the local community entirely, or is it in large part being siphoned out? I think Joshua Tree is a really good example because a lot of these Airbnbs are owned by people who are actually based in LA. So while Joshua Tree is this smaller, cuter town with a lower income base, a lot of this short-term rental money is not staying in the community. It's getting siphoned out. It's also worth asking, who are the owners of these short-term rentals? What is their race? What is their gender? How is that contributing to the overall wealth statistics in the United States? Recently, as the housing crisis in the United States has really come to the forefront of our news and more people are struggling to find housing, certain cities have started to put regulations in place on Airbnbs and short-term rentals. Atlanta, Georgia has recently passed new regulations around Airbnbs, where people can only own 2 Airbnbs total and one must be their primary residence. You must be a resident of Atlanta, pay $150 annually for a permit, and pay an 8% tax rental fee. Atlanta is one of these cities that has been feeling the housing crisis for a very long time, as well as experiencing an increase in cost of living. Atlanta has seen a 37% decrease in available long-term housing units since 2019, according to an analysis of the US Census Bureau data. Now, reactions to this Atlanta law are predictably mixed. Some people love it, citing gentrification and rising costs of living. Other people say it's unfair to penalize Airbnb owners who are putting money back into the economy. I think the Atlanta situation is particularly interesting because Atlanta is one of the few Black cities in the United States. About 50% of Atlanta residents identify as Black. And when we talk about gentrification, it should be within the context of class and race. Who operates these Atlanta Airbnbs? Where is the money flowing from and where is the money flowing to? Often we see money being siphoned out of Black communities into white communities via real estate. An example of that would be having a Black renter in a white-owned property, or having several Airbnbs be in a predominantly Black neighborhood that are owned by white people. Going back to New York, one study conducted by Inside Airbnb found that in 72 predominantly Black neighborhoods, white residents were about 14% of the overall population, but accounted for 74% of the host population. So short-term rental income is not being equally earned by all, and it's not being equally distributed into all communities. So now we come back to our question. Did Airbnb ruin the housing market? The conclusion that I've drawn is no, not totally by itself. There's a lot of reasons that housing is kind of fucked in the United States. But Airbnb certainly didn't help. And I think it's really important that we understand where money from Airbnbs is going and where it's coming from. If you are someone who lives in Austin, Texas, but you own and operate an Airbnb in Stowe, Vermont, that is money that is not staying in Stowe, Vermont. It's not staying in the local community. It's going back to Austin, Texas, to your bank account. Short-term rentals, I think, can be a really powerful tool for individuals to grow wealth, but can also be a really unfair tool that the already wealthy community is using to kind of continue to hoard its wealth. Airbnbs have absolutely contributed to a tighter housing market than we would experience without them. But did they ruin the housing market? No. Let the comments begin. Let me know in the comments if you own short-term rentals, if you want to own short-term rentals, what the impact of short-term rentals have been like in your communities. I'm super curious. I feel like living in Austin, I've had a front row seat to the rise of Airbnb empires by a lot of people. And it's really changed my opinion on housing in a couple of different ways. So I definitely want to talk about it with y'all. Make sure to give this video a like and hit subscribe.